When people first hear the phrase change management, they often picture paperwork, approvals, and slow meetings that feel like they exist to annoy everyone. In privacy, though, change management is less about bureaucracy and more about staying honest about what a system is doing with people's data as it evolves over time. A product rarely stays still, and data processing almost never stays frozen at the exact moment it was first designed, because teams add new features, integrate new services, and adjust how data moves to improve performance or user experience. The privacy risk shows up when those changes quietly alter what data is collected, how long it is kept, who can access it, or where it is sent, without anyone noticing the shift until a complaint, an incident, or a regulator forces the issue. The goal here is to understand how to control the risks that ride along with change, so processing stays aligned to what was promised, what was approved, and what is truly needed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful starting point is to define what counts as a change in data processing, because beginners often assume only big redesigns matter. In reality, small adjustments can have outsized privacy consequences, especially when they are repeated and layered over time. A change might be a new data field added to a form, a new event added to analytics, a new third party added for customer support, or a new retention rule that keeps logs longer for troubleshooting. A change could also be a shift in purpose, like using purchase data not only to deliver a receipt, but also to predict what someone might buy next. Even a change in how identifiers are generated, how consent is recorded, or how a mobile app requests permissions can affect how personal data is processed. The risk is not only what the change does on day one, but what it enables later, because new data collected today can become the raw material for new uses tomorrow. To control change risks, you need a clear understanding of baseline processing, which is the reality of how data is handled before any new modification is introduced. Beginners sometimes think the baseline is whatever the policy says, but the baseline must reflect the actual behavior of systems, not the idealized description. That means knowing what data elements are involved, where they come from, where they go, and why they are used, plus who can see them and how long they persist. It also means understanding the difference between primary processing and secondary processing, because secondary uses are where surprises often hide. Primary processing is what a person reasonably expects based on the service they requested, while secondary processing is everything else that might be helpful to the organization but is not strictly necessary to deliver that service. Without a reliable baseline, you cannot spot when a change quietly expands collection, shifts purpose, broadens access, or increases exposure. One common misconception is that privacy change management is only about consent screens and policy updates, as if privacy starts and ends with words. Notices and permissions matter, but they are a layer on top of the more important question: what does the system actually do? If a change introduces a new way to link identities across devices or adds richer metadata to logs, updating a notice does not magically make the risk go away. Another misconception is that if data is already collected, then any additional use is automatically acceptable because the organization already has it. That thinking ignores purpose limitation, fairness expectations, and the real-world harm that can come from reusing data in ways people did not anticipate. A third misconception is that engineers are the only ones who need to think about change, when in practice product, legal, security, and operations all influence how data processing evolves. Change management is a team sport, and privacy risk grows fastest in the gaps between teams. A practical way to think about change risk is to focus on what can shift along a few core dimensions. Collection risk increases when more data is gathered, when more sensitive data enters the pipeline, or when data is collected more frequently or with higher precision. Use risk increases when the purpose expands, when automated decisions are added, or when data is combined with other sources to infer new facts about a person. Disclosure risk increases when more people, systems, or vendors gain access, or when data moves to new regions, storage platforms, or environments. Retention risk increases when data is kept longer, when backups preserve it beyond the intended schedule, or when deletion becomes unreliable. Security risk increases when the attack surface grows, such as adding new interfaces, new tracking events, or new integrations that handle identifiers and account data. The point is not to memorize categories, but to train yourself to ask what has changed and how that change alters exposure and expectation. A strong change management approach uses a consistent trigger to force the organization to pause and examine privacy impact before the change ships. The trigger can be as simple as a rule that any change touching personal data must be reviewed, but that can be too broad if everything touches personal data, which makes teams ignore it. Instead, many programs use risk-based triggers, such as new categories of data, new purposes, new sharing with third parties, new automated decisions, major UX changes affecting consent or transparency, or changes affecting children or other sensitive contexts. Another trigger is a meaningful increase in scale, like rolling out a feature to millions of users instead of a small pilot. The goal of triggers is to catch the changes that matter most, without drowning everyone in paperwork for harmless edits. If triggers are vague, people will interpret them to avoid review. So it helps when triggers are tied to concrete changes a developer or product manager can recognize. Once a trigger fires, the review has to be fast enough to keep product work moving, while still being serious enough to prevent harm. Beginners sometimes imagine a review as a long legal memo, but effective change reviews are often short, structured, and focused on decisions. The reviewer needs to know what is changing, the reason for the change, and the expected benefit, because privacy is about balancing legitimate goals with limits and safeguards. The reviewer also needs to know what data is involved, whether any sensitive data is introduced, and whether identifiers are being created, strengthened, or linked across contexts. They should ask whether the change alters what users were told, what they consented to, or what they reasonably expect given the service. They should look for scope creep, where a change justified for one narrow purpose accidentally creates broad new capability. A good review ends with clear conditions, not vague advice, such as requiring a shorter retention period, tightening access, or adjusting the UX to make the change understandable. A useful concept here is risk ownership, because privacy change management fails when everyone assumes someone else is responsible. The person proposing the change should be accountable for describing it clearly and honestly, including trade-offs and edge cases. The privacy reviewer should be accountable for assessing impact, recommending controls, and documenting the decision in plain language that can be revisited later. Security teams may be accountable for confirming protective measures like encryption, access controls, and logging, especially when changes introduce new data flows or integrations. Product teams may be accountable for ensuring the user experience aligns with transparency commitments, including notices and settings that actually work. Operations teams may be accountable for making sure retention and deletion controls are enforceable in production, including backups and vendor systems. When ownership is unclear, changes slip through because no one feels the cost of getting it wrong. Another frequent source of privacy change risk is environment drift, where the same system behaves differently across development, testing, and production. Beginners might assume that if a feature was reviewed, then it is safe everywhere, but reality is messy. Testing environments often use copied production data, which can create privacy risk if access is wider or if data is kept longer than intended. Production rollouts often happen in phases, and early monitoring may capture more logs than planned to help debug. Then those logs quietly remain forever because nobody circles back. Feature flags can create hidden states where a feature is off for most people but still collects data in the background, or where a small subset of users is exposed to a risky behavior that is missed in broad reporting. Managing change risk means paying attention to where the change runs, what data it touches in each environment, and how temporary measures are retired. A review that ignores environment realities is like installing a lock on the front door while leaving the side window open. Controls are what make change management real, because good intentions do not prevent accidental overcollection or unexpected sharing. One control is data minimization at the point of collection, which means collecting only what is necessary for the stated purpose and avoiding extra fields or high-precision signals unless they are truly required. Another control is access control that matches need, so new data does not automatically become visible to more teams simply because it exists. Retention controls matter because changes often add new logs, metrics, or derived datasets that are easier to create than to delete. Transparency controls matter because user expectations are part of risk, and changes that affect people should be explained in a way that fits their context and does not bury the key point. Vendor controls matter when a change adds a new service, because the privacy posture becomes partly dependent on that provider's practices. The important idea is that controls should be chosen to match the specific change, not applied as a generic checklist. It is also important to understand how change management ties into incidents, because many privacy failures are really change failures that went unnoticed. A new integration might expose data to a third party in ways the team did not intend, especially if a default setting is enabled or a field mapping is broader than expected. A new tracking event might include a full URL with sensitive parameters, and that then gets stored in analytics systems where retention is long and access is broad. A new customer support feature might capture screenshots or message content to help troubleshoot, and then those artifacts persist in ticketing systems without a clear deletion path. In each case, the issue is not that the organization wanted to be careless, but that a change created a new pathway for data to spread. Good change management reduces incident likelihood by forcing teams to think through data pathways before they become real and costly. When incidents do happen, post-incident learning should feed back into stronger triggers and better review questions. Documentation can sound boring, but it is one of the most practical tools for controlling change risk, especially in long-lived systems with staff turnover. The purpose of documentation is not to produce a perfect library of policies, but to preserve decision context so future teams understand why a choice was made and what constraints came with it. A change record should capture what data was affected, what purpose was approved, what controls were required, and what residual risks were accepted in plain language. It should also capture dependencies, like which vendor or internal system receives the data and what retention or deletion commitments exist. When documentation is missing, the next team may add another change on top of the first, unaware that earlier decisions were conditional or limited. Documentation also helps when a regulator, auditor, or customer asks why a system processes data in a certain way, because you can show a trail of intentional decisions instead of scrambling to reconstruct history. In privacy work, memory is not a control, but documented decisions can be. A subtle but important part of managing change risk is recognizing how product incentives can push toward expanded data use, even when no one says that out loud. Teams may want richer analytics, stronger personalization, or simpler support processes, and those desires often translate into collecting more data and keeping it longer. That does not automatically make the change wrong, but it does mean the privacy review has to challenge assumptions like we might need this later, or it could be useful someday. Those phrases are warning signs because they hide the true question, which is whether the benefit is real and whether the risk is worth it. A mature approach encourages teams to define the measurable benefit of a change, such as fewer fraud losses or improved reliability, and then match data used tightly to that goal. It also encourages alternative approaches, like using aggregated metrics, shorter retention, or on-device processing, when those can meet the goal with less exposure. When incentives are acknowledged, privacy change management becomes more honest and effective. As you get comfortable with this topic, it helps to practice mentally walking through a before and after story for a change, because privacy impact is easiest to see in motion. Imagine a service that originally uses an email address to send order updates, and now a team wants to add phone numbers to support text updates. The new data element adds collection risk, and it may add use risk if the phone number later becomes a marketing identifier, plus disclosure risk if it is shared with a messaging provider. It also introduces security and retention questions, because phone numbers are stable identifiers that can be abused if leaked. A good change process would ask whether text updates are optional, how the number is verified, how it is stored, who can access it, and how it is deleted when no longer needed. It would ask whether users can choose email only without penalty, and whether the UX makes the choice clear. By thinking this way, you can see how even a simple feature can shift the privacy profile of a system. The last piece to internalize is that change management is not a single gate at the end of development. because privacy risk grows when review happens too late. If a team designs a feature assuming they can collect certain data, and then a late review forces them to remove it, frustration rises and shortcuts become tempting. The best programs encourage early thinking, where teams consult privacy during concept and design, then do a more formal check before release, and finally verify behavior after launch. Verification matters because what ships is sometimes different from what was intended, especially when multiple services interact. Post-launch checks can confirm that data fields match what was approved, that retention settings were applied, and that access is restricted as planned. When verification is skipped, the change record becomes fiction and privacy risk becomes guesswork. Managing change risks in data processing is really about creating a reliable loop: propose, assess, control, ship, and confirm.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.